Welcome to the seminar on Henry VIII's early foreign policy. In this seminar, we will examine the question, to what extent was Thomas Wolsey responsible for foreign policy, 1512 to 1529. This seminar will be split into 4 parts. Firstly, we will take our time to unpick the question. Then we will examine Wolsey's role as chief minister in both fashioning and delivering foreign policy. Then we will examine Henry's role, especially in terms of setting out the foreign policy aims and making demands upon his chief minister. Finally, we will then construct our answer using my 3-step plan to ensuring your response is focused on evaluation. At the end, I will show you an exemplar paragraph. You now have 1 minute to dissect the question, line by line, to consider what the question requires you to say in response. Firstly, it is a to what extent question. Therefore, the expectation is that you provide 2 sides to the argument and then arrive at a judgment about the level of extent Wolsey was responsible. This could be done in 2 ways. You could examine Wolsey's role in comparison to Henry's role in terms of decision-making and the administration of foreign policy. Alternatively, you could pinpoint the points in time when Wolsey was most responsible for setting the agenda, compared to the points when Henry was most in charge. Secondly, let's examine the phrase, Thomas Wolsey responsible. To be responsible for something means you have an obligation to complete the task. This does not necessarily mean you are in full control and therefore the ultimate decision maker. A store manager, for example, will be responsible for the sale of goods within that store. But this does not mean they have the final say on what is sold in the store. Finally, it is very important that you do not lose sight of the second half of the question. Anything related to domestic policy, such as the amicable grant, must tie directly back to foreign policy. Furthermore, any foreign policy event that takes place after 1529, such as Henry's later campaigns to France in the 1540s, will not be relevant to the question. Now that we have unpicked the question, let's examine Wolsey's role in greater detail. I am going to give you 30 seconds to consider what Wolsey's overarching role was in government between 1512 and 1529. Firstly, Wolsey was a problem solver. At the start of Henry's reign, he was the only member of the council to actively encourage Henry to conduct a military campaign in France. He rose to prominence after he organized the 1513 campaign, which resulted in the victory at the Battle of Spurs. After this he was appointed into the role of Lord Chancellor in 1515, and he focused mainly on domestic policies. This was when Henry's government shifted to a more ministerial style, with Wolsey making big decisions with the assent of the king. However, when Henry ran out of money in the late 1510s, Wolsey became a policy maker. He arrived at policies that would boost England's prestige without going to war. Later, in the 1520s, he remained a policymaker and used this to try and resolve the financial problems that the crown faced following the disastrous Third Campaign to France. Now consider an event that Wolsey was definitely responsible for and which acted as a great personal victory for him. I have chosen the Treaty of London of 1518. This was a personal victory for Wolsey as it boosted his reputation within the church because he took on the role of papal legate. It was also a triumph for Henry because it bolstered English prestige without the need to go to war. Now pick an event that Wolsey was responsible for, but this time something that could be considered a failure. I have picked the Amicable Grant of 1525. This was the illegal tax Wolsey tried to raise in order to fund a fourth campaign in France. His failure to collect this tax meant that Henry could not launch a campaign while Francis I was being held captive by imperial forces. Now we have examined evidence for why Wolsey was responsible for foreign policy. Let's look at the other side of the coin by examining Henry's role. As king, it was Henry's responsibility to set out his key foreign policy aims. He certainly took a greater interest in foreign policy than domestic policy, and his aims were ambitious. Now spend 30 seconds considering what these key aims were. Without a doubt, Henry's most important aim was to gain territories in northern France due to the historical claim that English kings had for the territory. He wanted personal glory and to emulate the legendary King Henry V. However, if he could not achieve this, he looked to any policy that would bolster England's prestige. He did not want to be isolated from European politics. Rather, he wanted his court to be one that was talked about and envied by other leaders. Finally, he did have some concerns about security and defense of his borders, especially given Scotland's old alliance with France. However, Unlike his father, he would not let those concerns override his ambitions. Now consider Henry's main aim to conquer lands in France. During this early period, when did he achieve this? He achieved this on only a single occasion with the Battle of the Spurs in 1513. This was a personal victory for Henry since he was present at the battle and he was able to gain the two towns of Therouanne and Tournai. We know Henry took personal responsibility for this victory as he used it as propaganda to boost his reputation as a military king. However, behind the scenes, it was Wolsey who had organized this campaign. Now consider an event Henry was responsible for, but this time something that could be considered a failure. There are two examples you could use here since both his first campaign of 1512 and his third campaign of 1522 were disastrous. However, I'm choosing to focus on 1512 as it shows how Henry was overly ambitious and naive at the start of his reign. This was also before Wolsey had been placed in charge of administration and organization for military campaigns. Let's now break down the 17-year period into 3 eras, starting with the years 1512 to 1517. Spend 30 seconds considering who was more responsible for this first era of foreign policy, Henry or Wolsey. I would argue that it was Henry more than Wolsey. He was young and ambitious, and he was determined to use the Anglo-Spanish alliance to launch a campaign in northern France. Now consider who was more responsible for foreign policy in the mid-era of 1518 to 1522. I would argue this was the era when Wolsey was most responsible for foreign policy, as it was the era that saw two important diplomatic events, the Treaty of London of 1518 and the Field of the Cloth of Gold of 1520. However, for both these events Henry still took a keen interest as he wanted to use the events to bolster England's prestige. Now consider who was responsible for events after 1522, once the Habsburg-Valois conflict was underway. There is an argument to suggest they were both responsible. Henry was responsible because he was the one who demanded to get involved in the conflict, even though his ally Charles V was more concerned about gaining territory in northern Italy. Wolsey, however, was responsible for turning that demand into two bad policies, starting with the amicable grant and then going on to switch sides in 1525 with the Treaty of Moore. By backing the wrong side in this war, England was sidelined from European politics in the second half of the 1520s, as shown with the Peace of Cambrai in 1529. Now arrive at an overriding judgment. Who was responsible for foreign policy between 1512 and 1529? The ultimate decision-maker was Henry, and he was the one who drove foreign policy in an aggressive direction. You could forgive his optimism in his youth, and you can forgive Wolsey's opportunism in helping him to achieve his 1513 campaign. However, Henry did not learn from his mistakes and continued to spend an extortionate amount of money on foreign policy. Wolsey was simply following the king's instructions. He was the king's servant and not an alter rex. Ultimate liability for the failures of foreign policy must lie at Henry's door. Let's now look at how we can put this understanding into a response for an essay under timed conditions. Whilst it might seem impossible to condense events and analysis into just a 6 sentences paragraph, I'd like you to give it a go. Remember, you can always provide a second paragraph with a counterargument that discusses the same era or theme. Let's focus on Wolsey for this paragraph. Give me, in one clear opening sentence, what Wolsey was responsible for. This is what I have written. Wolsey was responsible for the policies that resulted in a decline in England's prestige from 1525 to 1529. This provides a clear statement and also focuses my paragraph on a specific era, the final 4 years of Wolsey's tenure as chief minister. Now provide two sentences that focus on factual evidence. Give two examples that support your opening point. I have written, he arrived at the unpopular amicable grant illegal tax of 1525, which was a failed attempt to raise revenue for a fourth campaign. Furthermore, he was responsible for the diplomatic revolution, which saw England switching sides in the Habsburg-Valois conflict, following the Treaty of Moore of 1525. These two sentences are giving clear-cut facts that directly link to why Wolsey failed in his foreign policy in 1525. Details about the causes and consequences of the amicable grant are not necessary here, as most of that relates to domestic policy. Now write 3 sentences to show how this makes Wolsey responsible. You could by the end of this paragraph link in Henry's roles and responsibilities too. I have written the following. These were two bad decisions, as they meant Henry was forced to relinquish his claim to northern territories of France. Furthermore, it meant Anglo-Habsburg relations deteriorated, which would have terrible consequences when Henry needs to gain an annulment from Charles V's aunt, Catherine of Aragon. However, Wolsey would not have arrived at these two radical policies if he had not been pushed to meet Henry's increasingly unrealistic demand for prestige on the European stage. In this final sentence, I have linked back to my overriding argument that Henry made unrealistic demands of Wolsey as chief minister and therefore must take ultimate responsibility. This therefore shows implicit judgment. It could also act as a segue into a second paragraph on the 1520s that discusses Henry's demands to remain relevant to European politics and how this backfired with the League of Cognac and Peace of Cambrai. Now that we have practiced one together, see if you can write similar paragraphs for other aspects of foreign policy. Ensure you cover the full 17-year period in order to show breadth of understanding. You also need to write a short introduction to outline your key argument and points of discussion. If time allows, then add a conclusion that provides an overriding judgment, drawing from key arguments you have made elsewhere. But avoid making your introduction or conclusion too long. Most of the marks are gained from the main body of your essay. Thank you for watching. I hope this has helped to understand how you can fashion an essay on Henry VIII's foreign policy. Remember, it is just as valid to state that Wolsey was responsible for the majority of foreign policy decisions, so long as you back this up with clear evidence and reasoning.